You're listening to Reverie, True Crime, your gateway to the darkest corners of human nature, where we expose the hidden truths of human depravity. These harrowing stories serve as a sobering reminder to keep our senses keen and our awareness sharp, for predators lurk in unexpected places, patiently waiting and observing. Join us as we unravel mysteries, explore motives, and seek justice for victims as we bring awareness to these cases. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Reverie True Crime. I'm your host, Paige. Before we begin, I want you to know that this is the most difficult part of the series. The crimes committed against Channon Christian and Christopher-Newsom were extraordinarily brutal. What follows is based on court testimony, medical examiner reports, autopsy findings, and confessions from the perpetrators. If you are a survivor of sexual violence, please consider skipping this episode if you feel you need to. Proceed only if you are prepared for extremely traumatic content. In part 1, we learned about Channon Christian and Christopher-Newsom, who they were, what they meant to their families, and the futures they should have had. We covered their abduction from Washington Ridge Apartments on the evening of January 6, 2007, and how they were forced into Shannon's 4Runner and driven to 2316 Chipman Street. Now we must document what happened next. This is not sensationalism. This is the truth. This is what Channon and Chris endured. Their families have spent nearly 2 decades ensuring the world knows what was done to their children. We owe it to them and to Channon and Chris to tell the truth, no matter how painful. Let's get started. The house at 2316 Chipman Street was a small, rundown rental property in North Knoxville. It wasn't in a good neighborhood. Chipman Street was known for drug activity, prostitution, and violence. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business because asking questions could get you hurt. The house was rented to the girlfriend of LaMarcus Duvall, Slim Davidson, though she rarely stayed there. By early January of 2007, the house had essentially become Davidson's crash pad, a place where he dealt drugs, where his friends hung out, and where anything could happen without witnesses. LaMarcus Davidson was 25 years old. He had a lengthy criminal record, including carjacking and aggravated robbery. He had just been released from a 5-year prison sentence in August of 2006. Barely 4 months of freedom before he orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of Channon and Chris. LaMarcus was the ringleader, and everyone who testified agreed on that point. He made the decisions, gave orders, and he was in control. With LaMarcus that weekend were 4 other people: Latalvis Darnell Rome Cobbins, age 24. He is LaMarcus's half-brother. Latalvis had traveled from Lebanon, Kentucky to visit LaMarcus, bringing his girlfriend along with him. He had a prior conviction for attempted robbery in New York. According to his family, Latalvis was afraid of his older brother and wanted to impress him, to prove he wasn't a coward or a punk. George Giovanni Detroit Thomas was 24 years old, a friend of both Latalvis and LaMarcus. Thomas had a lengthy criminal history with multiple prior felony convictions. He was described as willing to go along with whatever LaMarcus wanted. Vanessa Lynn Coleman, age 18, was LaTalvis's girlfriend. She was the youngest, the only woman in the group. She had traveled from Kentucky with LaTalvis Cobbins and George Thomas. Vanessa's role would be debated throughout the trials. Was she a willing participant or a frightened girl who didn't know how to escape? Eric Dwayne Boyd, 34 years old, and an ex-convict who had met LaMarcus in prison. Eric Boyd had convictions for robbery and theft. He would later claim he was not present during the worst of the crimes, but testimony would place him at the scene, and ultimately a jury would convict him of murder. These 5 people, 4 men and 1 woman, had Channon Christian and Christopher-Newsom completely at their mercy. And they showed no mercy at all. When Channon and Chris were brought into the house, they were bound, blindfolded, and terrified. They were still dressed in the clothes they'd been wearing for their date. Chris in his jeans and favorite Carhartt jacket, Channon in jeans and a sweater. They had no idea what was about to happen to them. Christopher-Newsom was only 23 years old. He was a carpenter who loved baseball, and he was falling in love with a girl named Channon. On the night of January 6, 2007, he was dragged into hell. According to testimony from the perpetrators themselves, particularly George Thomas, who eventually agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, what happened to Chris Newsom began almost immediately after he was brought into the house. Chris was kept in a separate room from Channon. He could hear her crying. He knew she was terrified. He was probably terrified too, but trying to stay calm, trying to think of a way out, and trying to figure out how to protect her and himself. Unfortunately, there was no way out. The medical examiner, Dr. Darinka Maluznik-Polchin, would later testify about Christopher-Newsom's injuries. Her testimony, delivered in a calm, clinical voice, described violations almost too brutal to comprehend. Chris was anally raped multiple times. Medical evidence showed he had been violently sodomized with an object, something hard, something that caused severe internal injuries. The attack was slow, prolonged, and it was meant to hurt. It was meant to humiliate, and it was meant to break him. But that wasn't the end of his suffering. At some point, likely in the early morning hours of Sunday, January 7th, Eric Boyd and George Thomas forced Chris to walk out of the house barefooted. It was January in Tennessee, cold, maybe near freezing. Chris had been stripped of all of his clothing and stripped of his dignity. They walked him to a set of railroad tracks near the Chipman Street house, a desolate area behind the tracks where trains occasionally passed, but where no one would notice a man being murdered in the dark. Chris's hands were still bound behind his back with a shoelace. His ankles were tied with a belt. He had a sock stuffed in his mouth and held in place by another shoelace wrapped tightly around his head. A sweatshirt had been pulled over his head, covering his face. He was blindfolded, gagged, bound, and helpless. And then they shot him. The first shot hit him in the back. It was not immediately fatal. Chris was still alive, still breathing, and likely in agony. The second shot hit him in the neck. Still, he lived. And then Eric Boyd, according to George Thomas's testimony, pressed the barrel of a gun against Chris's head, just above his right ear, and pulled the trigger. That shot severed Chris's brainstem and killed him instantly. But they were not done yet. After Christopher-Newsom was dead, his killers poured gasoline all over his body and set it on fire. The flames consumed his remains, destroying much of the DNA evidence that might have been recovered. The fire was still smoldering hours later when a Norfolk Southern Railroad employee found the body around 12:30 in the afternoon on Sunday, January 7th, 2007. When police arrived, they found a young man's burned corpse lying beside the tracks. His body was positioned in a way that suggested he had been restrained, hands bound, legs tied, and face covered. The medical examiner would later determine that he had been shot 3 times, raped, and burned. But at that moment, the police had no idea who he even was. They had no idea that his girlfriend was still alive, being held captive less than a quarter-mile away, and enduring horrors that would last for another day and a half. Christopher-Newsom died alone, in the cold, beside railroad tracks, and murdered by strangers for no reason other than evil. His parents, Hugh and Mary Newsom, would have to identify their son's burned body. They would have to hear the details of what was done to him. They would have to live with those images for the rest of their lives. But Chris wasn't the only victim that weekend. While he was being tortured and killed, Channon Christian was still alive, held captive in that house, waiting for her turn to die. While Christopher was being walked to the railroad tracks to be executed, Channon Christian was held in a bedroom at the 2316 Chipman Street home. She was bound, blindfolded, and she was surrounded by people who had already proven they were capable of rape and murder. She knew Chris was gone. She must have heard him being taken out of the house. She must have known, on some level, that he wasn't coming back. And she must have known as well what was coming for her. According to testimony from the perpetrators and evidence collected at the scene, Channon was held prisoner in the north bedroom of the house. Vanessa Coleman was assigned to watch her while the men were killing Chris. Vanessa would later claim that she was terrified herself, that she didn't know what was happening, and that she was just doing what LaMarcus told her to do. But she didn't call the police. She didn't let Channon go. She didn't try to help. When the men returned from murdering Chris, they turned their full attention to Channon. What happened next, according to the medical examiner's testimony and evidence presented at trial, was a campaign of sexual torture that lasted approximately 36 hours. Channon Christian was raped repeatedly by multiple assailants. She was beaten, kicked, and was degraded in ways almost too horrific to put into words. The medical examiner who performed Shannon's autopsy testified that Shannon's death came after hours, possibly more than a full day, of sustained sexual torture. Channon suffered severe injuries to her vagina, anus, and mouth. The medical examiner stated that she had been raped vaginally, anally, and orally. The injuries were consistent with being raped not just by men, but also with an object, possibly a broken chair leg or something similar. The penetration was so violent it caused extensive internal damage. She was beaten in the head repeatedly. She had bruises all over her body, on her face, torso, and her limbs. She had carpet burns consistent with being dragged or held down on a floor. She was kicked in the vagina and groin area repeatedly, causing massive hemorrhaging. Forensic evidence showed that Lamarcus Davidson's sperm was found in Shannon's vagina and anus. LaTalvis Cobbin's sperm was found in her mouth. DNA evidence linked both men directly to the sexual assault. According to George Thomas's later testimony, Channon was tied to a chair while being raped. She was unable to move, unable to fight back, and unable to escape. She could only endure. At some point during her captivity, Channon spoke to Lamarcus Davidson directly. In his own statement to police, Lamarcus admitted this. He said Channon grabbed his arm and said, "I don't want to die." Think about that for a moment. A 21-year-old college student, bound and brutalized, looking at the man who was orchestrating her torture, begging for her life. "I don't want to die." But Lamarcus didn't care. None of them cared. And so the torture continued. At some point, likely on Monday, January 8th, 2007, after Channon had been held captive for more than 24 hours, her captors made a decision. They were going to kill her, but first they wanted to destroy evidence. Bleach was poured down Shannon's throat. Think about what that means. Bleach. A caustic chemical that burns tissue on contact, forced down the throat of a living, conscious woman. The medical examiner testified that Channon was alive when this happened. She would have felt it burning in her mouth, her esophagus, and her stomach. She would have gagged, choked, and tried to spit it out. But they held her down and made her swallow it. Then they scrubbed her body with bleach, particularly her damaged genital area, in an attempt to destroy DNA evidence. Again, Channon was alive during this. The pain must have been excruciating. After they had tried to erase their crimes, they prepared to dispose of her body. Channon was hogtied, her wrists and ankles bound together behind her back with strips of bedding and curtains. This position is not just restraint, it is torture. You can't move, you can't get comfortable, and you cannot breathe deeply. Then a small plastic bag was pulled over her head and tied tightly around her neck. A trash bag. Not even a quick death. Suffocation, slow and terrifying. Unable to see, unable to breathe, and knowing you're going to die. Then her bound body, still alive, still breathing, was stuffed into 5 large trash bags, one inside the other, 5 layers of plastic between her and air. And then she was placed inside a residential garbage can in the kitchen and covered with sheets. The medical examiner testified that Channon slowly suffocated to death inside that trash can. The medical evidence showed that she was alive when she was placed inside. She tried to breathe. She struggled against the restraints, but the bags, the hog tie position, the small space, there was just no air. There was no escape. Channon Christian died alone, in the dark, inside of a trash can, after enduring more than a day of unspeakable torture. While she was dying, slowly asphyxiating in that kitchen trash can, the perpetrators were in the house. Some of them drove around in Channon's stolen 4Runner. They smoked weed and acted as if nothing unusual was happening, as if a young woman wasn't dying just a few feet away. On Tuesday, January 9th, 2007, after Channon's parents had already found her abandoned 4Runner and police had already discovered Chris's body, investigators finally made it to 2316 Chipman Street. There, in the kitchen, inside of a garbage can, they found Channon Christian's body. She had been dead for hours, maybe a full day. The trash bags were still intact. The hog tie restraints were still in place, and the little trash bag around her head was still tied tight. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy was a professional with decades of experience. She had seen terrible things, but Channon Christian's autopsy shook her. When asked in court to describe the sexual assault, Dr. Darinka called it extreme and stated that it was much more than a simple sexual assault. The prosecutor asked, "Can you put into words the magnitude of this assault?" The medical examiner paused, then said quietly, quote, "The best way I can describe the victim's anal injuries is that the tissue was shredded," end quote. Shredded. That is what they did to her. By the time investigators found Channon's body on Tuesday, January 9th, her parents had been searching for her for 3 days. Gary and Dina Christian had reported their daughter missing. They had searched the streets. They had found her abandoned 4Runner, wiped down, cleaned of fingerprints, and left on the street just 2 blocks from Chipman Street. Dina Christian had woken up on Sunday morning, January 7th, with a terrible feeling. Channon had not come home. She wasn't answering her phone. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. By Tuesday, when investigators confirmed that they had found a body at the Chipman Street house, the Christians' worst fears were realized. The discovery of the bodies, Chris on Sunday, Channon on Tuesday, launched one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Knoxville Police Department history. But even before investigators had identified the perpetrators, evidence was already pointing them in the right direction. Inside Channon's 4Runner, which had been recovered on Monday, January 8th, investigators found an envelope. On that envelope was a fingerprint. That fingerprint belonged to LaMarcus Davidson. That fingerprint would be the beginning of the end for all 5 perpetrators. On Wednesday, January 10th, 2007, Knoxville police detectives and Knox County Sheriff's Department investigators obtained a search warrant for 2316 Chipman Street. They had already had Shannon's body, but now they were gathering evidence for prosecution. What they found inside that house told a story of depravity. There were multiple items belonging to Channon, like her gray purse, her pink high heels, her iPod, inscribed, quote, "Channon Christian, Mom and Dad, we love you." Her camera, photographs from her vehicle, her toiletry items, a pay stub from her work, and her mother's Blockbuster card. Christopher-Newsom's belongings were 2 baseball caps, including the one he was last seen wearing, and his driver's license. Inside the home, the trash bags that contained Shannon's body had LaMarcus Davidson's fingerprints on them. A box of trash bags in the house also had LaMarcus's prints. Forensic analysis of the house revealed blood evidence, DNA evidence, and other materials linking the victims to the location. But the most damning evidence was the DNA. LaMarcus's sperm was found in Shannon's body. LaTalvis's sperm was found in her mouth. The forensic evidence was overwhelming and indisputable. On Thursday, January 11th, 2007, police arrested Eric Boyd at a vacant house on Reynolds Avenue. Inside that house, they found Christopher-Newsom's size 9.5 Nike Shox athletic shoes and a .22 caliber high-standard revolver, the gun that was used to kill Chris. Eric Boyd was taken into custody. Under questioning, he initially denied everything. Then slowly his story changed. 5 different versions in one interview session. You can also hear these interrogations on YouTube. First, he wasn't at Chipman Street at all. Then maybe he was there, but he didn't know what happened. Then he admitted seeing some things, but he didn't participate. Eventually, he admitted to being present during the crimes, but claimed that he was not involved in the violence. Also, on January 11th, LaTalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman were arrested at Natasha Hayes' house in Lebanon, Kentucky, where they had fled after the murders. During the search, officers found Shannon's red purse containing her documents and belongings. They also seized a computer on which LaTalvis and George had been following news coverage of the murders. LaMarcus, the ringleader, was still on the run, but on January 11th, Eric Boyd, possibly hoping for leniency, told investigators where to find him. Police found LaMarcus hiding in a crawl space at a house in Knoxville and arrested him. All 5 of the perpetrators were now in custody. None of them were cooperating. Each was blaming the others. Each was trying to minimize their own role, but the evidence did not lie. The forensic evidence, the eyewitness testimony, the belongings found in their possession, and the DNA linking them to the sexual assaults, it was overwhelming. By mid-January 2007, prosecutors knew they had solid cases against all 5 defendants. The evidence was there, and the charges would be extensive: kidnapping, rape, robbery, theft, and murder. multiple counts, multiple victims, and multiple perpetrators. It would take years to untangle it all in court, years of trials and appeals. Eventually, a scandal involving the judge himself would force retrials and extend the family's agony. But that comes later. For now, in January 2007, the focus was on the victims, on making sure the world knew what happened to them, making sure justice would be served. Channon Christian and Christopher-Newsom were dead. Their families were shattered. The Knoxville community was horrified. And 5 people were about to face the consequences of their evil. Join me for part 3, where we will learn about the 5 defendants, the initial trials that spanned from 2008 to 2010, the judge's scandal, and the retrials. If this episode has affected you, please reach out for help. You can contact the RAINN National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. There's also the crisis text line, where you can text HOME to 741-741. Or you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by dialing 988. Or you can text 988. Until next time, everyone stay safe, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.
Thank you for listening to this episode. As we close out, let us not forget awareness is our greatest defense. In a world that can be dark and grim, vigilance is our beacon of hope. When it comes to the cases we have explored together that have remained unsolved, if you happen to hold a piece of the puzzle, dare to step forward. As author Lois McMaster Bujold once said, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them." Until we reconvene, my friends, stay vigilant and stay informed.